Hello and good evening. Thank you for attending the Manitoba Craft Council Spring Talk Series, co-sponsored by MAWA, Mentoring Artists for Women's Art. The Manitoba Craft Council is located in Winnipeg within Treaty 1 land, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dene, and Dakota, and is the birthplace of the Métis Nation. The Manitoba Craft Council was founded in 1978 as Manitoba's only not-for-profit arts organization dedicated exclusively to contemporary craft. In these challenging times, the Manitoba Craft Council is proud to create programming to help artists, craftspeople, and other makers adapt with the rapid and continuing changes in our community. I acknowledge that I am in Toronto on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. My name is Nehal. I'd like to begin by thanking the Manitoba Craft Council and MAWA for inviting me tonight. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share with you what I've been thinking about in relationship to text and tactility, to language and craft. Thank you for coming out tonight. You could be anywhere in the world and you're here with me, and I appreciate that. I invite you to use the chat to say hello, let me know you're there, respond to anything that I'm saying. I'm sitting in front of a bookcase. I'm wearing a black top and wide hoop earrings made by Jordan Clark. I'm here because I'm the editor-in-chief of Studio Magazine, a biannual print publication dedicated to contemporary Canadian craft and design. There's a copy of the magazine sitting right behind me showing the work of Allele Studio, who make custom prosthetics. For this talk, rather than lecture at you, what I've done is gathered a collection of objects and texts that shape the way that I have come to think about text, language, craft, making, material, process. While I'm talking, I'd also like to invite you to use the chat to add your own touch points. If there's anything that I say that makes you think of a particular object or text, please feel free to put it in the chat. And later on, after all of this is done, we'll collate and share it. So let's map out all this terrain and its points together. I'm a science and environmental journalist by trade and a planning academic. I'm pretty new to craft. I came into this community in this world less than 2 years ago. I entered the craft world because I had come across Studio Magazine. I'd gone to pick up a subscription for a friend. And while I was leafing through it, it shifted the way that I thought about craft. And I was really intrigued by it, especially as a journalist who talks about environmental issues, about social justice issues, about the ways in which we live and move through the world. And I had never considered that we could use crafted objects to do that. At the time, the work that was being done by Studio really invited me to consider this possibility of human-object relations in terms of the makers and artists, the processes that they use, the mediums that they chose to work in, and how you could talk about place and environment and technology and relationships and family and lineage and heritage and memory and immigration and borders and labor and work. And it was just an incredible way to produce this really engaging and thoughtful commentary on the world. So I like to think about craft as a Trojan horse, and that's the work that I do with Studio. We encourage and support and develop writing that takes that critical and engaging, but also fun and playful writing. I started thinking about language and craft, obviously, as I came across my own research and reading and trying to learn more about craft, but also in editing the work of people who were more familiar with different aspects of craft than I was. And it made me think about this relationship between language and matter. In the Abrahamic traditions, language came before energy and it came before matter. Let there be light. And that is how the universe came into being. And so language comes first, and language shapes and it determines, but it also responds and it communicates and it memorializes and it protects and it preserves and it produces lineage and heritage. And so thinking about what is it that I talk about when I try to talk about craft, I've come across all of these different objects and texts that I use to help shape and shift and direct me. One of my favorite quotes is from the hip hop poet Saul Williams, and he says, "Words matter, become matter," also in reference to this creation of the world that we're in. When I look at writing, I mean, people talk about writing as a craft, and I'm not talking about that now. I'm talking about, the production of text. We usually think about the text as the finished object, but writing is also a process and a way of examining and making sense and looking at and figuring out how we think or how we feel about any particular thing. And in engaging with these texts, there have been so many moments for me where my own cosmologies and ways of thinking about and engaging in the world have changed. There have been all of these encounters that have invited me to consider matter and temporality different, like at a panel with Megan Price when she had referenced a writer who said something about rocks are liquid if you change the timeline. And I still walk and I think about that. I think about the ways in which we understand material, we understand the processes of production, but then how do we engage with the breaking down, right? How do we talk about that? How do we look at it? As somebody who studied planning, I've worked with a lot of geographical theory, and it also, like, craft is incredibly specific to place, whether it's through the people who make it, through the processes and techniques that have been learned, through the raw materials that have been used. And so there are these relationships of learning and figuring out, of teaching. There's also temporality when it comes to craft, and the language of desire when it comes to producing and owning. Right? There's also, this is what I want to do. This is what I need to do. This is what I would like to see. This is what I want to possess and own. And all of that being entangled in and woven with craft is something that's really interesting to me. I also find craft fascinating and has developed me as a writer when looking at metaphor, and not just in the way that Annie Albers references material as metaphor or matter as metaphor, but in the ways in which different techniques can be applied to narratives. So things like weaving a story is metaphor, but when it's done, you can almost visually map the way in which a narrative or strands of narratives are woven together to complete a tapestry. And here I'd like to reference Melanie's talk for this same series, which was an incredible and moving example of what happens to a story when you treat it that way, intentionally. When they talk about knots in the weaving that they're doing, and then when you study the language that they use and you find the knots in it too, it's a remarkable process, and there's so much to learn from craft. There's also dealing with the unknown, and what I found surprising for me personally is that how many artists never know what their finished product is going to be. There's that idea of desire and what they're planning to manifest, but then there's also this acceptance of what will be. That material isn't completely controllable. And it's been interesting to also hear artists talk about that moment of humility when they go from wanting to master a material, to own it, to this desire to know it, and then to realize that it's a collaboration rather than bending to will. There are so many pressing issues that we deal with in the world. One of the most obvious ones in relationship to craft that I've been thinking and talking about and trying to publish about are the social justice issues and the hierarchies of power and the accumulation of capital and material and wealth. And that comes in at the very basic level. Who gets to do craft? Who gets to produce crafted objects that are considered in particular ways? Because in the West, there is contemporary craft and fine craft. But when you start looking at the global South, you talk about folklore and tradition. And it becomes anthropologized when it's coming from different places. And so I'm really interested in the ways in which language about craft reflects these relationships to place and people, the ways that language about craft reinforces inequalities, but can also be employed to flatten these hierarchies. And I find that really interesting. I'm working on a project looking at craft of African origin throughout the diaspora, and just the different ways in which craft is examined. And we're talking about, things from how craft is used to just function in the world, to live, right? Like techniques for making beds or chairs, or pottery for eating. But then the ways in which these crafted objects are also overlaid with, or imbued with beauty and history. How these objects are designed to produce legacy and be passed down through generations, how these techniques are taught and carried on. And once again, this is also not to fall into the language of fetishizing or romanticizing craft from the African continent, which is what I'm looking at specifically, but to understand all these different relationships. I'm really interested in this question of what makes us human. I walk through the world as a Black woman. I'm perceived and I'm reacted to and responded to as a Black woman. And so I'm interested in the ways in which our relationships with each other, with objects, with places, with technologies, determine how human we get to be in a particular space. And so what is our relationship to craft, technique, and process? What social capital is achieved through accumulation or through knowledge or through the ability to make? I'm also interested in the ways in which craft has been rediscovered recently, if I might say so, or maybe that's just me. But this idea, in response to mass production and conspicuous consumption, and the desire for things that aren't as ephemeral or as trendy, that things that can last, that can contain more and more and more and more history and more memories. Because this being in this world has also shifted my relationship to objects. At the beginning of the pandemic, I wrote about this specific mug that I've been sipping from, and how, because of how I related to it, it provided a grounded presence in my life. And every time I reach for it, it's the same thing. It's made by Queenie. And it's a really beautiful mug, and it feels so good to interact with, right? And so these engagements with crafted objects and the interactions that they invite have also made me consider things like, can craft provide a solution or a way to address the eco-anxiety that we feel through our mass consumption? So there's been a whole bunch of different ways in which language and craft come together for me. How do you describe these feelings and emotions? How does a maker describe how they produce the work, the processes, the language? Where do you get them from? Who authorizes you? With what authority do people speak with when they talk about these techniques of making? The other thing about text and language and objects are, another quote that I really like is from Thomas King and The Truth About Stories. And when asked, what is the truth about stories? He says, stories are all that we are. And we create, in our relationships with crafted objects, we create these stories, we create these metaphors, these ways of being in the world. We experience different emotions. A response to certain objects can be way more visceral than just the use of it. It can stir feelings. It can, and now I'm losing language about it. It can invite a shift in perspective. I can see here that somebody's written, objects contain our memories. The memories are created in partnership with the object. It's our experience with it. It's what they trigger. It's what what we think of. It's the values that we ascribe to them. That also comes back to desire and possession and relationships, right? Yeah. There's, sorry, just give me a second, please. A lot of my research deals with virtual space and virtual objects, so things that you can't touch. And that is why I named this particular talk Text and Tactility. I wanted to focus on this sense of touch in contrast to a lot of the work that I do on these intangible virtual or digital objects and spaces, because that's the thing that intrigues me most, like this contact of skin against clay or against wood or against glass or against fabric, the different ways in which human ends and object begins, these interfaces. I have here a bowl by K.O. Young, and this was, I think, one of the first conscious moments when a crafted object found me. There was an exhibition at Craft Ontario, and I had picked it up and found myself standing there holding it for maybe 10, 15 minutes. I don't know how long, just like that, because of the way that it fit into my hand. And I'd heard about this from artists, the ways in which objects try to go home with you. And I'd never had that feeling before. And I'm really intrigued by it, about how it just fits perfectly. Because ceramics isn't a field that I have studied, I don't know how to talk about the glaze, which is beautiful. I don't know how to talk about the process used to make it, or the graininess of the interior, right? I don't have that particular professional language or jargon for it, but I do know that it fits here perfectly. I do know that I feel a sense of peace and calm when I use it. I do know that it's not a bowl that I can use to eat from. I don't have that relationship with it, but it's a bowl that I just pick up and hold. And I'm curious about that. Like, what does that relationship say? Another object that I'm really very fond of are these very small plates that are surprisingly very useful, but were made as whimsy by a potter, Gaia, from Gaia Studios in Montreal. Because I don't speak about technique and process in a particular way, I'm interested in the ways in which they take on meaning. And as somebody who comes from an immigrant background, somebody who's had to move around a lot, I didn't get a chance to form attachments to many objects that weren't portable, or if that were too delicate or fragile to be moved around. So it's a different way of learning about things that I'm trying to figure out, that I'm trying to work through right now. For this issue of Studio Magazine, which came out during the pandemic in fall, winter of last year, I wrote in it, as we move through the portal of the pandemic, we can start to consider a new world. Artists, makers, craftspeople, and designers intimately and viscerally understand the process of formation and its potentially surprising outcomes. Here's to co-creating and building a world together. It's in the language of formation that, we're moving towards the end of the pandemic, I hope, and we're in the process of making a new world. And I think that the language of craft lends us ways in which to think about producing. It also creates space for us to consider the unexpected and the surprising, and to allow things to take the shape and the form that they need to take. So I'm going to stop right there and invite conversation about anything that I might have said that would have triggered any questions. Thank you, Melanie. One of the passages that I had pulled out as a reference point for this talk is by André Gali. And he writes, objects have biographies and ontologies. They come into being at some point in time and live lives of a certain length, maybe 1 second or 5,000 years. Through their existence, objects take part in shaping the world both physically and emotionally. For makers, creating and shaping objects to be used and or experienced is the raison d'être. The objects may grow beyond their intended function, as Yukayama describes. Another one to directly talk back to Adriana's comment was objects, and perhaps first and foremost, the instances of use that occur with them, can evoke memories in a number of ways, as most of us likely have experienced. A particular memory and the feelings associated with it can be uncovered through a sound, a scent, or perhaps when we touch a particular surface. In comparison with the memories we can call forth with the help of sight, the memories evoked by other senses are sometimes hidden from us and can appear suddenly without us being prepared for them. Described as the most important sense for gaining information, for taking action, but the question is whether the other senses are not even more important when it comes to evoking memories and feelings, which is a way more succinct way of how I was trying to describe this particular interaction. Adriana asks here, could you please talk more about the relationship to craft memories and being a person who moved a lot? I moved a lot in my childhood. I was born in Sudan and I grew up for a period of my life between London, England and Aarhus, Denmark. Moved back to Sudan and then went to high school in the Middle East. And so I would shift between hoarding and having absolutely no attachment to objects because they're difficult. It's difficult to move around with a lot. And so when you have to get rid of things as a child, when things are gotten rid of on your behalf, you learn that attachments to objects aren't going to serve you because they could go away or they could be left behind or given away, and they don't make it to the next home. And so when I first started moving out by myself, I started collecting objects and I couldn't get rid of things because it was the first time in my life where I'd been given control over the objects in my life. So that was a relationship that I had to navigate and explore. And then as I grew older and I became more environmentally aware, my relationship to objects shifted. There's that overused quote, like, don't have anything in your home that doesn't bring you joy. But, that's a privilege to be able to do that. And also when you're trying to be more environmentally conscious, if you can't just replace things because you don't like them anymore. I hope that answers your question, Adriana. Gentle Spring Rain asks, how do you write about practices or objects that evoke discomfort? That's I think objects allow us the distance to talk about difficult subjects. I think, in a way that I hinted at when I was talking about addressing eco-anxiety. We don't know how to deal with environmental disaster or climate change, but we can wrap our head around material not being available to work with. We can deal with, trying to preserve objects to repair or restore rather than replace. So the object gives us that ability to do something about the anxiety that we feel or the discomfort that we feel. As I mentioned, when we talk about race, it's easier to talk about objects than it is to talk about people. It's easier to talk about the way that objects are treated or that language is used to talk about objects than it is to talk about language that is used to talk about people. And we can see how, for example, it's been simpler or less complicated in a way to address the return and repatriation of objects than it is to give citizens equal rights. So yeah, I think, and then it's easier to talk about craft's potential to be inclusive than it is to critique the power structures that make it exclusive. It's easier to say, we can look at the universality of ceramics and find commonality there than talk about the differences. Could I talk more about tactility and language? There's a quote in a book that I don't have on me right now, but it's by Nigel Thrift and Ash Amin, and it's about the city. And it talks about how we talk about the city as skyscrapers and buildings and roads and all of this physical and material infrastructure. And this particular quote says that we talk about it, but we don't pay attention to the hands as a way of, the hands as the means of bringing the city into being. And I think about that quote a lot too, the ways in which making, and which is also, like I'd like to point out, is pretty ableist, but the fact that we use our hands to produce and make at every single scale, and the touch and the movement of the digits and the ways in which people's work is reflected in their hands is a particular obsession of mine, like where calluses form because of different ways of working, how nail beds are affected by making. I'm also really interested in the ways in which children explore the world through touch. When I had my own children, and how they would just touch things, and that would be part of their literacy of the world around them. How does it feel? Is it smooth? Is it rough? Is it warm? Is it cold? Is it spiky? Do I like it? Do I not like it? And it's this very visceral engagement that intrigues me, and that we don't necessarily engage with the world all the time like that, not at the level that children do. Lisa Walter. It is never an innocent act to ask someone to share a story. Do you think this is true of storytelling and craft? It is hands down my favorite demand of other people. Like, tell me a story. What's your story? What happened to you today? Tell me a sequence of events over time. Like when I ask you, how are you? Tell me how you got to this particular moment of feeling. I love hearing stories. Is it innocent? Sometimes. I'm a journalist, so a lot of the times it's not. But sometimes it's just, I want to hear a story. I want to know something about you. Hey, Melanie, how do I think the resurgence of craft will impact or affect the future? My biggest, I guess, concern about that is who is going to get to do craft and how and where. There are so many formal craft institutions that, like pretty much almost every other institution, have challenges with inclusion. And so that concerns me a lot. I think that craft has the potential to address a lot of the tensions that we feel. But then I also think of the example of Khalil Seavright, the carpenter in Toronto who was building the tiny shelters. He's like, people are dying. I can build these shelters. I can save some lives. So I'm just going to do it. Like, this is my craft. This is my skill. This is my trade. I'm going to make these tiny shelters for homeless people so they don't freeze to death. And I think about the response to that, which is the city tried to shut him down. And so that to me says a lot about who gets to do what and what spaces and why. You have somebody using their craft to save lives, and yet the systems that are in place are designed to not allow that. But having said that, I think that craft has so much potential that we haven't seen yet to be subversive, to do things like that. I think of, knitters' resistance acts. I think of, the ways in which people with skills just go ahead and fix things that the system doesn't want to deal with. And so that gives me both hope, but seeing the institutional response gives me concern. I would love to see craft grow, develop in both ways. I would love to see makers become increasingly radical and subversive with the work that they do, but I would also like to see the institutions that produce and recognize and support makers and artists to become more inclusive, and then ideally, I hope the two will meet. Do I think digital approaches is going to affect the tactile knowledge of humans? All right, I think that one of the biggest things that has come out of the pandemic is that we have now lost casual, intimate touch. We don't hug our friends when we see them. We don't kiss them on the cheek. We don't grab people's hands. We don't engage in all the little, we don't hold somebody's elbow or lean on their shoulder. And I'm not talking about with intimate partners or with family. We've lost that with friends, and we've lost that with, people that we like. If you've ever been in a situation where you're hanging out with somebody that you don't know really well, and then you realize that they like you because they lean over when you say something and they just touch you slightly. We don't have that communication at all. What we do have are never-ending Zoom meetings. So I wonder what the outcome of the loss of this intimacy is going to mean. And then I also wonder what we're going to substitute it with, literally, in the same way that I cup that bowl because it gives me comfort in a particular way. I don't know if I hold it more often when I get less touch. I don't know if it's any kind of a substitute. I know that when I was younger, I would dress up in my mom's silks, and just because I liked the way they felt on my skin and because they smelled of her. So I think that there's something there, but it'd be interesting. It'll be interesting to see what happens. Thanks, Adriana. I do have more quotes that I could continue picking up all night, but this is from a Manitoba artist. It is my favorite globe. It is actually my only globe, but I love it. It's beautiful. It's by Andy. And I was drawn to it because of my background in geography, but also because it kind of looks like a star. It's also something I touch a lot, but then I try not to touch it so that the oils in my fingers don't affect it. So I try to be very careful with it. I also have here a clay sardine that was part of an installation of the School of Fish that was meant to show how schools of fish would swim together and how activists could move and swim together. But then when they were all suspended, they got all chaotic, almost like a group of activists. And that was done by a very, very dear friend of mine, Coco Guzman. I like that. You're holding the hands of the bowl maker. I've never met K.O. Young. If anybody would like to connect me with him, I do hope that our paths cross. One of the things that I wasn't going to bring up because I'm pretty early in how I've been thinking about it is the role of the machine in craft and production and machinic tools, and how, when we're looking at the relationships that make us human, how this collaboration with a person and a machine then produces this object. But we don't think of it as collaborative. We think of these machines as tools or ways to enable. And I'm really curious about that. And I'm not just in a simple or primitive tool way, but the ways in which dynamic machines or things like 3D printers work together. And then at what point does human machine turn into mass production? But I'm still thinking through that. How do you go from being an artist to manufacturer? When it also comes to language and craft, and this is specifically about pottery, it's from an essay called Centering by M.C. Richards. And it talks about centering as transformation. And I've been learning this language too, and it's been coming into the way that I write in other outlets. And this is the text. There are two things which I have been thinking a lot about. One is the experience which in pottery we call centering, and one is the experience which in nature we call metamorphosis. As human beings functioning as potters, we center ourselves and our clay. And we all know how necessary it is to be on center ourselves if we wish to bring our clay into center and not merely to agitate it or bully it. As organisms in the natural rhythms of birth, growth, and death, we experience metamorphosis throughout our lives as our bodies grow and change from infancy to ripeness, as our capacities for inner experience enlarge and strengthen. As potters, we have an especially immediate and concrete daily experience of both these more than physical processes. And then I'm skipping forward a little bit. We experience the mud. We experience the forces of time and destiny that have transmuted rock into plastic dust. We experience the raw wear, the sudden spell of a mobile act brought into stillness. The newly thrown or constructed pot has a quality which is not to be found in any other phase of its life. This was also a passage that I thought much about in terms of text and tactility, because you can imagine the ways in which a potter engages with clay. and the molding and the shaping. And one of the biggest lessons for me in learning about pottery was how little control you have over anything in it. And so I've gained this new appreciation for all the pottery in my life that is incredibly beautiful and stunning. And not just skill and talent, but intuition and trust. Are there other questions or comments or things that you would like to share? Heidi, that passage that I read was also one of the ones that I had marked as being very strongly in response to tactility in language or tactility in text. Oh, I missed a question there. What do I like to read if we're writing about craft? Um, hmm. I've been working through a few texts that, like recently, that have been teaching me a lot. The last passage that I read is in The Craft Reader, which was edited by Glenn Adamson. I have a beautiful collection of books about material that comes from the Norwegian Craft Council. And I did read one of the passages that I read earlier was from there. But they talk, like this one talks about ornament and rhetoric in craft and the allegorical impulse. And speculative realism. I read a lot of old issues of Studio, and that's both to look at how the magazine has developed and to make sure that what I'm doing is still in line with its intention, but also to learn and look at different ways of talking about craft and different perspectives. My most recent acquisition was The New Politics of the Handmaid, and here I'll plug Leo, who has a chapter in it. He was the editor-in-chief of Studio before I joined. I also listen to a lot of music, so a lot of like music without words, instrumentals, jazz music, piano. There's also this passage from an essay called An Emotional Perspective on Everyday Use. Functional objects bear images of us as users and as human beings. A glass gets its form, quite obviously, one might think, from the need to be able to be grabbed and lifted, from the shape of our mouths, and from the amount of liquid we need to drink on a given occasion. The glass has, then, a direct relationship to our bodies and their proportions. But this glass, through recurrent, widespread use, has also been laden with more metaphorical and on another level, emotional meanings. Using these bodily relations and metaphorical emotional meanings as points of departure, the event that occurs when a user in a given spatial context and from her or his specific physical, mental, and cultural preconditions sets the object in motion, thereby fulfilling its purpose as a functional object, and in so doing also defines himself or herself as an artifact using human. This goes back to the human-object relations that I was talking about. We think about our relationship to objects a lot in terms of how we perceive the value of the object and how it communicates something about us as people, something about our tastes or our social standings or the ways in which we want to communicate to the world. We fancy ourselves a particular kind of person when we use a particular kind of cup. But a cup is just a cup. So it's adding that layer of meaning to it, assigning it that much more value, associating it with how we perceive and understand ourselves. Is something that I'm really interested in. It's from a book called Material Perceptions, and it's from the Norwegian Crafts Council, Lisa. Melanie is asking, wondering if you could speak about experience of tactility you've had at exhibits. I can think of some ways touch is invited, but curious for others as well. True story, I almost got thrown out of a museum for touching a Van Gogh. I didn't know, I was young, I didn't know that you couldn't touch it, and the texture of it was really inviting. It was just so bumpy, and I just wanted to feel it, and then almost got thrown out. So when I was talking about the hierarchy of crafts and fine arts and crafted objects that get elevated to a particular stance, one of the easiest ways to assign value to an object is to not allow people to touch it. You can take anything, put it on a plinth, throw a velvet rope in front of it, and all of a sudden it's way more valuable. A plinth and a velvet rope, that's all you need. Many artists have pointed this out, and it's not something that we don't know. And yet, and some people like Banksy have taken it way farther with the shredding photo or the banana taped against the wall. The value of art isn't necessarily in the material value of the object at all. And the quickest way, having said that, the quickest way to depreciate the value of an object is to allow people to touch it. And that's true in a lot of instances. That when people start handling it, then its value goes down. It's this when objects are rarefied. I actually hadn't thought about that. The fact that touch can be leveraged to assign or remove value in certain spaces. I'm gonna have to walk and think about that one a bit too. That's really interesting. I think that's about it in terms of my own experiences with tactility. I mean, obviously the Van Gogh example was one that stayed with me for a really long time. Are there any other questions or comments or thoughts or responses? Hey, Connie, the object becomes less important as you age. and face getting rid of those objects. I think that can go either way. I think that our attachment to objects is why there's whole industries, like whole multi-billion-dollar industries devoted to getting rid of objects. Everything from like the KonMari method is about attachment to objects. It's an object-oriented ontology that says that we should either be very, very attached to very, very few objects or not attached to objects at all. Hoarding is a pathology, like the gathering of objects is a problem. But then we have heirloom items and things that are designed to be kept, to become legacy, to move through families, that carry history, and they become really hard to get rid of. Also, there's some burial traditions where you get buried with certain objects. And so the attachment to objects is, I think, also has changed over time and is reflective of a whole bunch of things on different scales, from the personal to the social to generally what we feel. A lot of it too is tied into the environmental responsibility that I think has been in response to mass consumption and production. Thought we have all been put behind a velvet rope in terms of access to touch in some ways, but I wouldn't say it has appreciated our sense of value of ourselves or each other. That's true. Preserving the object versus the experience of using the object, giving additional meaning to be such an interesting contrast. I mean, technically, I don't ever use that bowl. But this idea of preserving versus use is also something that I'm learning about more as I learn from the community. Like, what are the intentions of the maker? That was an interesting thing to me, that some makers were like, I let go of all attachments to the objects that I make. Other ones are like, oh, I love to see what happens to my objects over their lives as I let them out into the world. Even more are like, there are some objects I can't even let go of. I'd rather destroy than give away, which, there's a difference between a human-object relationship when you've made the object and when you're using it. Oh, wow. So much dialogue around the object. I've started using 100-year-old bowls, cups. So that's the kind of thing that I never could have fathomed, because, once again, because of moving around so much, there's not really much. I hardly have anything passed down for me. Neither, like my grandmother, I don't have belongings of my grandmother. That, like, I don't have her her silverware. I don't have her home decoration items. Nothing, because the moving around wouldn't allow for it. In terms of mass production, there's the idea of the ephemeral, the throwaway as a strategy of capitalism. Yep. So the keeping of objects that are meaningful can be a subversive act. Yeah, but again, like I mentioned earlier on, hoarding or holding on to objects is a pathology too. We judge people's relationships to objects depending on the context. Collecting is something that is respected. When there's more deliberation about it. Yes. Any last questions or comments? One thing I'd like to say before we end is that I found this craft community really kind and generous and welcoming and very enthusiastic and willing to share what they know and what they learn. And it's been consistently my experience without any exceptions, whether I've been here in Toronto or traveling in other places. And specifically, I'd like to thank my colleagues at studio. So Jenna Heemstra, Lara Katsuba, Dale Barrett, Julie Nicholson, and also Leo Kowalik, who I came in after. And then a whole bunch of other people that have been so supportive and so kind in teaching me so much. I'd also like to thank you for your time and your attention and the conversation. It's been really great to be able to talk through things that I'm still working out and thinking about, and hope to continue thinking about. I would love any suggestions or recommendations. I would invite you all, shameless plug, subscribe to Studio, but also visit the website or Instagram. Let us know what you think. Share story ideas with us. Like I said, I've learned so much, and I feel like I've grown so much just in how I am in the world through these conversations around making and objects. And I really appreciate these opportunities and times and conversations and teachings. So thank you so much to Manitoba Craft Council and MOA for having me here today. I tell you all to get home safe, but I assume that you're already at home. Thank you again for your attention and conversation, and hopefully we'll be seeing you at some other event, either online or one day in the physical world. Take care, everyone, and have a good night.